Well, I finally reached the end. This one was a real struggle to get through, but I reached the end. No more Aftermath for me, and hopefully no more Chuck Wendig either. This book and the Aftermath trilogy as a whole left such a bad taste in my mouth that upon finishing this book, I actually stopped reading for a month. Not just Star Wars books, all books. Even this review is being written in November when I finished Empire's End in early September. I just couldn't face going back and writing it. I actually struggled to write this review because there's so much to talk about, and I honestly wasn't sure what the best place to start was. I couldn't decide whether to start with the plot, the characters, inspirations and influences from the old extended universe, or Chuck Wendig himself. There's just so many issues, it's difficult to decide. Let's go with the plot first. It's more interesting than Aftermath and about on par with Life Debt. It still lacks any punch to it, and when it does actually get interesting, it quickly deflates because the book ends. It does set up the future for both The Force Awakens and the 35-year gap, and I hope in the future we get a book that explores what happens to the Empire on its journey after it leaves Jakku, as long as it's not written by Chuck Wendig. Since that won't happen until the sequel trilogy is completed, or at the very least Snoke's origins are revealed, we won't get that anytime soon. But when the time is right, it's something I look forward to reading. The plot throughout the whole book though is just kinda drab, which seems to be Chuck Wendig's calling card. Nothing exciting ever really happened, and on the odd occasion something mildly interesting did happen, I quickly forgot about it after wave after wave after wave of boredom was thrown at me from the pages. This book, like his other two, is quite simply boring, and there's no saving a book when everything about it is boring. Even the ending is boring. The consequences the ending has and how it drives the future of the galaxy forward is interesting, but the way it's presented is just dull. I was expecting something with a lot more oomph to it, but unfortunately the entire plot ends with three things. The Battle of Jakku, which we all knew was coming since it's been teased for literally years now. A secret, which I won't spoil, and is the most interesting part of the book because of how important it is to the future, although in and of itself it's not that interesting. And a hole in the ground, which has to be one of the most anticlimactic ways to end a trilogy, but ironically matches the tone Chuck Wendig has created in the trilogy as a whole. Then there's the characters. I'm not sure how Wendig has managed to do this, but I read Life Debt, then to break things up I read Twilight Company, then I considered reading Empire's End, but had this sense of dread, not dissimilar to going to your first detention or how I imagine it would feel walking into the doctor's office when you're booked in for a vasectomy, so I decided to read Dark Disciple instead, because I thought maybe all I needed was a bit more of a break before returning to the Aftermath trilogy. No book should make you suffer dread before you start reading it. If it's a horror book, if it's Stephen King, while you're reading it, that's fine. That's like going on a roller coaster. You're supposed to be scared, you're supposed to feel dread, but not before you start reading the book. When I did eventually decide to stop procrastinating and read Empire's End, I realised I didn't remember some of the main characters, and I didn't remember some of the events of the previous books, and it's because it's all so drab. The characters Wendig has created are quite simply uninteresting, and there's a criminal underuse of the heroes we all loved from the original trilogy. One of the main characters even dies in the book, and I was thinking to myself, who is that? Why is that name so familiar? And of course, it turns out it was a main character in the first two books. How can an author have a main character who was in all three books die without people even remembering who that character is? It's just piss poor writing. Then there's the inspirations and influences from the old extended universe. Chuck Wendig has really tried to imprint himself on the new EU, and it detracts from the experience of reading the book. Rather than focus on the main story and produce a quality beefy tale, Wendig has instead chosen to try and create a legacy for himself. This includes bullshit like the Death Star being rebuilt by its own victims, a band of pirates led by a tranny, and something else, but I can't remember what it is because it's all so forgettable and drab. And the worst thing is, you know why he's done this. You know why. As you get further and further through the books, and especially Empire's End, you realise that while some of his interludes have wrapped up, a lot of them haven't, and you can't just have another Death Star floating around the galaxy. That means someone else will have to wrap up the story. That means whenever someone reviews the book that explains the origins of the Death Star, Aftermath will be mentioned, and this is what I mean about him imprinting himself on the new EU. We didn't need the Death Star rebuilt, let alone by its victims, but this is the first trilogy in a new universe, so he's taken a cue from good old George Lucas and Timothy Zahn. In A New Hope, Ben had that throwaway line about the Clone Wars, and in Heir to the Empire, the first book in the old extended universe, and the launch of the first trilogy in the old extended universe, it had that throwaway line about outbound flight. Wendig has tried to copy this by inserting his own legacy in the future of the franchise, but where Lucas and Zahn had us wondering what the Clone Wars were and what Outbound Flight was by having characters reference them in conversations about the past, Wendig has just decided to flat out insert them into the story instead of weaving them into the narrative, leaving absolutely nothing to the imagination and therefore failing to pique any curiosity. He's also tried to influence his legacy by creating and introducing the first gay character in the Star Wars universe. As I explained in my Aftermath review, I'm fine with gay people being in Star Wars, and that's a part of Wendig's legacy I applaud, but pointing out gay characters when these characters didn't even have speaking parts and no effect on anything whatsoever detracted from the value of having a gay character. In Life Debt, he toned it down, and he did the same in Empire's End, and Sinju was the only character, but if it had been like that in Aftermath, I wouldn't have criticised it at all. It's more important to have a gay character done right than have 100 gay characters that add nothing. It's a simple matter of quality over quantity, and clearly that's a value Wendig doesn't have. Wendig has also drawn influence from the Jedi Academy trilogy by Kevin J. Anderson, one of my favourite tales from the old extended universe. In Empire's End we see Mon Mothma fighting a political battle against a politician much more eager for war than her, but that's it. There's no real oomph to this subplot either. The whole thing is just plain, whereas in the Jedi Academy trilogy there was a multi-layered approach. Enemies from outside, enemies from inside, and enemies from outside manipulating allies on the inside. And all these layers combined created depth to the story, and it's that depth which made it all interesting to read. Empire's End has none of that. It's very plain Jane and boring. Reading it feels like Wendig has no imagination. In my review of Life Debt, I criticised the grammar, particularly in Interlude, where every time he or she was spelt, it was spelt with a Z in front of it. Apparently this is a gender-neutral pronoun, and I was unaware of such a thing existing. However, it's quite an unknown word, and I'd bet most people who read the book thought it was a grammar mistake. The worst thing is though, the reveal that the pirate is transgender could have been made in Life Debt. There was absolutely no reason for the Interlude to split between two books. This meant I went from an interlude in Life Debt up to the interlude in Empire's End thinking it was a grammar mistake, but if it had been in Life Debt, I could have understood it straight away and just carried on with the story. Instead, it's yet another interlude that's been stretched out as much as possible in a desperate attempt to keep readers interested, and it fails. Yes, it was interesting, but it should have been in a single interlude in a single book. There are so many eye-rolling moments that it just makes you want to give up. The Death Star being rebuilt, the transgender pirate, there's nothing technically wrong with it. It's all just a bit cliche, and who wants to read a book of cliches? No one. But that's how Empire's End and the entire Aftermath trilogy feels. From the boring characters to the uninspired plot, it all just seems like generic sci-fi and distinctly not Star Wars. And when the book you're writing is Star Wars, that's not a good thing. That's a fail. Maybe how generic the characters are is why they're so forgettable. I don't know, all I do know is they are. Empire's End is what Aftermath books have been building to over the last 2 years, and to be honest, after forcing myself to read all 3 books, I've drawn one simple conclusion. Aftermath only needed to be one book. The conclusion of the story mostly revolves around Grand Admiral Ray Sloane and Gallius Rax. In the original Aftermath, the only plot we had concerning the Empire was that they had a meeting to decide what direction the Empire would head in, both figuratively and literally, now that the Emperor was dead. Not a lot happened concerning the Empire in that book, and the only time Gallius Rax was in Aftermath, apart from the odd transmission as a false spy, was on the very last page, and it turns out he was only testing Sloane throughout the whole book. That means everything Sloane went through had no real consequences, and nothing anyone did in the book affected the rebels in any meaningful way. This means nothing really happened with the Empire, nothing really happened with the rebels, and the character that was most important to the plot of the whole trilogy was barely in the book, which means book 1 is nothing. It's an entire book of filler. So assuming the Aftermath trilogy was just a single book, everything that happened in book 1 could quite simply have been referred to in the book, or been a large prologue. Or they could have cut the plot of the first book entirely, since the conclusion of Empire's End involves Rax deliberately bringing both the rebels and the Empire to Jakku. The intel that takes them to Akiva in the first Aftermath could simply have taken them to Jakku instead, eliminating all of book 1 entirely. This would have helped by completely removing, or at least cutting down, the filler Wendig has had to use to make these books seem like individual novels, and by removing filler and having quality content within the book would automatically have been better. This would have allowed Wendig to have the Kashyyyk storyline from Life Debt run in parallel with the Jakku plot in Empire's End. Rather than having Nora and her team on Kashyyyk, they could have had her story on Jakku, just as it was in Empire's End, but at the same time, we could have had Han, Leia, Chewie and the droids working to free Kashyyyk. This way, we would have had Nora's little band doing their thing, but we also would have had our favourite characters from the movies doing their thing. I think Wendig has forgotten that one of the reasons the old extended universe was so popular is because it had our favourite characters in it, and it was their further adventures that were interesting, and this is shown most in the fact that R2 and 3PO are absent from the entire trilogy. I know if Aftermath had been released like this as a single book called Aftermath rather than as a trilogy, it would have been as thick as Vision of the Future, but at least everything in it would have been important and interesting. It would have been a plot plot-driven book full of interesting characters, both old and new, and probably would have received much better reviews. But sadly, it wasn't, and what we got was the Aftermath trilogy, and Empire's End is as much a disappointment as the entire Aftermath trilogy. It's a shame. There was so much potential in this immediate time after Return of the Jedi. Kathy Tyers managed to do it just fine 25 years ago when she wrote The Truce at Bakura. Timothy Zahn managed to do it just fine 25 years ago when he wrote the Thrawn trilogy. So Chuck Wendig has absolutely no excuse for creating such a low quality story and low quality characters. Rather than focusing on giving fans a good swashbuckling adventure, he's focused on his own legacy, what he's introduced, and what people can refer back to him in future books. This isn't the way it's supposed to be. The fans should always come before the author's own ego. This is a big part of why fans of the original trilogy didn't like the prequels. If he's not writing it for the fans, then who is he writing it for? And if you don't believe that he's focused on his own ego, I saw a video on the official Star Wars YouTube channel where they were interviewing him. At some point in the video, and he was being sincere, he actually used the phrase, "Let's go back to the prequels." Star Wars fans don't want that. Some of the younger ones might, but not long-time fans. This explains why Bones is a battle droid and not, say, another robot of the same model that IG-88 was. It explains why we had more Jar Jar, and that really says something about Wendig's ego, because even George Lucas himself toned down Jar Jar's appearances in the movies as he received fan feedback about him. All this shows that even though people have spoken, Wendig wants to go back to the prequels and fuck the fans and what they think. His ego has spoken. It explains everything wrong with these books. Empire's End is just a complete disappointment in a completely disappointing trilogy. Chuck Wendig has had his chances and I do not want him involved in Star Wars anymore. He is bad at writing Star Wars.